Don't touch. We tell our kids when they reach out to touch the flickering flame of a candle. We do it. We tell them that's hot. That'll burn you. We used to tell our kids that'll give you an owie. That made sense to kids, I guess. I don't know. But we send that message that fire is dangerous. And fire can be deadly, can it not? Fire can be deadly. So we teach our kids fire safety. Don't touch the candle. Don't play with matches. Don't run around the campfire. We are at school. The schools have fire drills. Right here in this building right now, if you look up, you'll see the sprinkler heads. Most of the time, we never notice those things, but it's a good thing that they're here, right? If you look around right now, you probably never noticed all of the fire extinguishers in this building right now. I'm counting 4 of them just in this one room. And they're important to have here. They get inspected every year to make sure that they're working correctly. So does the fire suppression system. Everything is so important because fire can be so deadly. Right now, I can think of 3 different fire stations just kind of surrounding us a little ways. There's one just down Daniels, a little past where we live. There's one back towards 6 Mile. Cypress just set off of 6 Mile. Then there's one over on Crystal, just off of 41. All of them pretty close to us, which is kind of comforting, right? You know, if dispatched, they could send fire trucks filled with firefighters to put out any fire. And it's important because fire can be deadly and dangerous. Because it is deadly, fire can also be a fearful and dreadful thing. Something that could alter our choices, right? Is that not what we tell our kids? That's hot. Don't touch. It'll give you an owie, right? What we're really trying to do, we're not trying to teach our kids the difference between hot and cold. We're trying to alter their choices. We're trying to alter their decisions. We're trying to teach them, don't reach out and touch that. Keep your hand away from that. We're trying to alter their choices, and fire can do that because it's so deadly and so dangerous. Turn to your Bibles, if you would, to Daniel chapter 3 as we continue our series, Daniel, a Prophetic Survey. And we're going to consider this morning just how difficult it can be to take a stand for our faith when faced with a fiery trial. In this story, of course, you're probably familiar with this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their fiery trial, but it was that fire, because of its deadliness, because of the danger that it posed, that was meant to alter their choices. It was there to serve as a reminder of the fact that they needed to conform and to fit in and to go with the crowd. And instead, this morning, we're going to find out that these 3 young men took a stand. Before we get to the fiery furnace, though, we need to go to the beginning of this narrative. We need to consider the decree. That's point number 1, the decree. Look at verses 1 through 7. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then, here we go again, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, and the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Before we get to the decree, first of all, we see in verse 1 that Nebuchadnezzar set up an immense image. He sets up an immense image, and it's interesting. If you were here last week, you know that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of an immense image, right? And so it's interesting that now he's actually setting up. This isn't a vision. This is a real image that he has commissioned to be formed and sculpted and overlaid with gold, and it's set up there in the plain of Dura. It's probably made of earthen bricks. For this to be, we'll talk about the size of it in a moment. For that to be solid gold would take an awful lot of gold, and it's probably not solid gold. It was probably made of earthen bricks and then overlaid with gold. But still, it's remarkable that this image is made. It's 60 cubits high. And you know what a cubit is, right? Well, just in case, I got a graphic there to show you. It's 18 inches, okay? By our modern, it's roughly about 18 inches by our modern measurement. So a foot and a half. All right, that makes the math pretty easy, right? 60 cubits then would be 90 feet tall. Get that for a moment. Now think about this. If you lived on the 9th floor of a high-rise apartment building right next to this image, you could look out your window and see the face or the head of this image. That's huge. 90 feet in the air. That's remarkable. It was 6 cubits wide, which that means it's only 9 feet wide. 90 feet and only by 9 feet. We'll talk about that a little bit more. That's a little bit of a disparity. But Nebuchadnezzar set this image up in the plain of Dura. Now, nobody really knows for sure where that is, but we have a pretty good idea because the word Dura means a walled place. A walled place. If you were here last week, you remember I mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar had built the city, Babylon, and he put around it not one but 2 walls. There was a double wall that went around that city to make it supposedly impenetrable, and we'll find out later that it wasn't as impenetrable as they had hoped, but that was the idea. So the Babylon was a walled place, so more than likely the plain of Dura was actually just outside of the city of Babylon, probably somewhere in the vicinity of the main gate into the city, right there where if you were going to come to Babylon, you would have to walk right past this 90-foot tall image as you came into the city. And the question that has to be asked, why would he have this image built and set up just outside the walls of mighty Babylon? Why not put it inside the city? I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? Why not do that? Why did he put it outside of the walls? And the answer, I believe, is that he meant for it to impress and intimidate. He meant for it to impress and intimidate. In fact, that's kind of revealed in verses 2 and 3, where the king orders all the high-ranking officials throughout the entire empire to come to the dedication of this image. Nebuchadnezzar ordered all the provincial rulers and officials to come to Babylon in order to impress them and intimidate them and remind them that their king, that he is their king, and that Babylon is not to be trifled with. Kind of reminded me a little bit of in Beijing. In the very center of Beijing is what's known as the Forbidden City. You've probably seen pictures of this before. We've seen this and been there more times than I can remember, but that's right the very center of the city. And what the Forbidden City is actually it's a palace complex that was the home and certainly the seat of government in ancient times, but it was the home of the ancient Chinese emperors in the ancient dynasties, and it was built to impress. Okay, it was meant to impress. You go through. We only went all the way through it one time. Once was enough. believe me. But we went all the way through it, and it just goes on and on. One huge courtyard, one huge palace, one huge building after another. It was meant to impress. It was a place in ancient times where no common or ordinary person was ever allowed to set foot inside. They were forbidden to go inside. That's, of course, why it was called the Forbidden City. Only the royal family and certain officials were allowed inside this palace complex. But every once in a while, a foreign dignitary would come and would be granted access inside the Forbidden City. But before he could come into the Forbidden City, that's the main gate there you see in the picture. Before he could come in through that main gate, he first had to walk through Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is ancient, but it is the largest square in the world. And it was built in ancient times right in front of the Forbidden City. You can kind of see the main gate in one of those pictures there from a distance. But that's not all the square. It goes on, and it's huge. And it was meant to intimidate. The foreign dignitaries, when they would come to the Forbidden City, they would have to walk the full length of Tiananmen Square. Why? To demonstrate the might of the emperor. Basically, the emperor wanted the foreign dignitaries to come away with the impression that he was all-powerful. And that, I believe, was why Nebuchadnezzar made this immense image and had it set up where he did. Okay? Now, opinions vary as to what this image may have looked like. Some believe that it was probably an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Others believe that it was an image that was similar to the one in his vision or his dream we talked about last week in Daniel chapter 2, except for the fact that instead of having different building materials, it was all made of gold. And some believe that the purpose in that, remember that Daniel told him, you're the head of gold, but there's an inferior kingdom that's going to take your place, represented by the arms and the chest of silver. And so some believe that by building this image all in gold is kind of Nebuchadnezzar's way of saying, no inferior kingdom is going to take my place. No inferior kingdom is going to supplant mine. But we don't really know. Remember that it's 90 feet tall and only 9 feet wide. That's the disparity there. That's really tall and not very wide. And so some have speculated because of that maybe it was more of an obelisk, kind of like the image there on the left that you see. An obelisk, just if you don't know what that is, think of the Washington Monument. That would be an example of an obelisk. And some think that's what this image was. Maybe with a more of an image or statue on the top, maybe made like Nebuchadnezzar or the image from his dream. Whatever it was, he built this image and he put it outside of the walls of the city. And the reason that he did that, okay, we don't know exactly what the appearance was. We can only speculate about that. All we really know is what we read in verse 1 about the dimensions. But we know from verses 3 through 5 that it was meant to be worshiped. It was meant to be worshiped, which leads us to believe that Nebuchadnezzar, on a bit of a pride-filled power trip, wanted not only political power in his empire, but also religious power throughout the Babylonian Empire. He was seeking, most likely, to unify the world's religions. Remember that the Babylonian Empire was vast and covered many smaller kingdoms that had been vanquished by Nebuchadnezzar and his armies. And so you've got a lot of religions that were represented in the Babylonian Empire. And so you got Nebuchadnezzar who's like, I've got all this political power, I've got all this military might, I've got economic power, I've got all of that, but all these people are worshiping their own gods. And he wanted to unify that and centralize that so that he could have power even over the people's religion. That's why he called all the people from all the languages and all the nations and all the governors and the prefects and all the officials from all over the empire to come to the dedication of this golden image. I don't want to make a lot of this, but it's important for us to understand that Nebuchadnezzar, to whom the God of heaven had given the kingdom. Remember that in chapter 2, verse 37? Right? It was God who gave him the kingdom and the power and the might and the glory. We read that, chapter 2, verse 37. We saw that last week. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is seeking to take worship away from the God of heaven and direct it to his golden image. And really, he's seeking to direct it toward himself. Because his political power, his military power, and his economic power just didn't seem to be enough. He wanted to impress and intimidate the world with his religious power. And so in verse 6, he decreed that failure to worship it was illegal and would lead to incineration. If you don't fall down and worship the image when the music begins, came the herald's proclamation of the king's decree, then you will be thrown into the fiery furnace. And I want you to see, as I was reading, I was kind of highlighting the fact in verse 3 that when the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials from all of the provinces had gathered together, they did what? Verse 3, they stood before the image. But in verse 7, when the music began to play, all these people from all of the nations and languages fell down. They fell down. All of them. Do you notice that? All the peoples fell down. None of those people who had their own gods and their own worship, none of them were willing to take a stand for their own religion or for their own beliefs. They all fell down before this image. Meaning they got down on their knees and they prostrated themselves with their face to the ground. And they fell down. In fact, the phrase fall down or fell down is repeated 6 times in verses 5 through 11. It's repeated 6 times. When we see a word or a phrase that's repeated that often in such a short period of time, that tells us something. It tells us there's something important being communicated here, and what's being communicated here is that conformity was important. Everyone was to fall down, but there were some who chose not to conform. They took a stand. Verses 8 through 12. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Now we come to the devotion. Point number 2, the devotion. Okay. And we're talking, of course, about the devotion of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their devotion to God, the God of heaven. We know of their devotion to God because of certain Chaldeans. We read about in verse 8. Tattletales is what they really were. Okay, and we know from a couple weeks ago. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar first had his dream, he called in all the magicians and sorcerers, enchanters, and Chaldeans. And we talked about why are these Chaldeans? That's an ethnicity. Why are they included with these magicians? And I mentioned at that time that by that time, Chaldeans had sort of become synonymous with those who were experts in the magic arts, and so it kind of became more of a title than it was more of a magician title than it was an ethnic title, and so that's who we are. When we read these Chaldeans, basically what we're reading is some of these wise men. Okay, that they came to Nebuchadnezzar. All right, and these guys, they were accustomed to having the king's trust. They were accustomed to the king listening to what they had to say. But you remember from back in chapter 1, after meeting Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, that Nebuchadnezzar lost his trust in these magicians, these Chaldeans. He looked at these 4 Jews, and he said, they are 10 times better. He was thoroughly impressed with them, and he lost, the magicians and the Chaldeans, they lost favor in the sight of Nebuchadnezzar. Last week we saw chapter 2, verse 49, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were all promoted so that they had oversight in the affairs of Babylon, something that no doubt irked the Chaldeans to no end. Okay? These kids were foreigners, and who are they to come and be equal to us, have a place amongst us as wise men? They're not happy about this. Now, they're probably also not happy about Daniel. A lot of people ask, where is Daniel in this story? And some people have said, well, maybe he must have just been off on a journey, but that doesn't really compute, because Nebuchadnezzar called all of the governors, all of the prefects, and Daniel was right there in Babylon, so that doesn't make sense that he was off on a journey and he wasn't there. He would have been expected to be there. The big difference was, if you look back at chapter 2 and verse 47, that after interpreting the dream, it says that the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the what? All the wise men of Babylon. In other words, Daniel was the boss of the Chaldeans. And he was the head of that entire province. There was probably not much chance that they were going to turn on Daniel at this point. Maybe they would if things went well, see how things go with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but they weren't going to turn on Daniel. I think what we know of Daniel is he was right there with these guys. He wasn't going to bow down either. But they don't come after Daniel. They come after these 3 who are probably more like equals to them in the kingdom at this point. And so they come there. We know that they hated these guys because they maliciously accused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There was malice. There was contempt in their accusation. They hated these 3 friends of Daniel. In fact, their hate caused them to become tattletales, really. In verse 9, they flatter the king. Verse 10, they remind him of the law that he had enacted by royal decree. Verse 11, they recite the consequence, the fiery furnace. All right? And in verse 12, they tattle on their 3 friends. When you were a kid, you ever have someone tattle on you? Were any of you the tattletale? Anyone who can admit to that? Were you the tattletale? I remember one time when I was in Sunday school class, and at the beginning of the Sunday school class, it was a boys' class back then. It was boys and girls in different classes. So it was the boys' class. I don't remember what year it was, but we had a man from the church was our teacher, and so we began with prayer. And the teacher was praying, and at the end of his prayer, I said to the teacher, Doug didn't close his eyes during prayer. I didn't think that one through very well. You know what the teacher said, right? How do you know? Oh, I didn't think about that. He caught me. And I was wondering, why doesn't Nebuchadnezzar say that to these guys, to these Chaldeans? They say, hey, they're not bowing down. Nebuchadnezzar could have just said, how do you know? Because if you were bowing down, listen, bow down, it doesn't mean like, get down on one knee. It means get down flat on the ground. You're down on your knees with your face on the ground, prostrated on the ground. All you can see is the soil right in front of your eyes. How do you know? But he didn't ask. Nebuchadnezzar didn't ask that. When he heard the malicious accusation, he just got furious. He got angry. And so we come to verses 13 through 18. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." King Nebuchadnezzar was furious because 3 men took a stand. When everyone else fell down to their knees and bowed down with their face to the ground, when everyone else conformed, when everyone else followed the crowd and tried not to stand out, when everyone else just wanted to fit in, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood their ground. They took a stand, and they refused to fall down before the golden image. Why? Because they knew what God expected of them. Remember, I mentioned a few weeks ago that these young men would have been born and raised toward the tail end of King Josiah's reign in Judah. And Josiah, early in his reign, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And one thing he determined was to do a renovation plan on the temple. And as they were doing the renovation plans, they discovered the book of the law. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine a church? Can you imagine we just did all these renovations? Can you imagine that like someone says, "Hey, I found this book. Anybody know what this is?" "I think that's the Bible. You know, I haven't seen one of these in years." That would be unthinkable, right? Everybody go like this. Yes, that would be unthinkable. We don't ever want that to happen. But that's what happened. In Judea, they found the book of the law, and they're like, "Wow, we haven't seen that for years." Well, there's the problem. There's why Manasseh was such an evil king, and his sons were an evil king. But Josiah says, "Look, we need to read it." And when they read the law to him, he tore his clothes, and he began to grieve. Why? Because he knew that the people had been disregarding the law of God. And he made all of these changes. He brought all of these changes in place, and these reforms were put in place where the people began to worship God. In fact, he reinstituted Passover. They'd gotten so far from God, they forgot about Passover. So he reinstituted that. And so the world that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were born into and were raised, that culture was one of renewed faithfulness to God, renewed teaching of God's word, which means they would have known the will of God, right? They would have known Exodus 20, verse 3, "You shall have no other gods before me." They'd know that. They would know Deuteronomy 6:5, "You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart and soul and strength, with all your might." They would know those things. And they certainly understood there's no way we can bow down to this golden image. Their faith was in the God of heaven, and they stood firm in their faith. They took a stand for that which was right. Friends, we live in a world that calls on us and pressures us to conform, to fit in, to compromise, to go with the crowd, to not stand out, but to fall in line. But that might be the world we live in, but understand we have a God who has called us to take a stand and to stand firm in our faith. Let me give you a few examples of that. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith. Act like men, be strong. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Philippians chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my crown, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12. I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm and over again. Throughout God's word, God implores us to stand firm in our faith, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood when everyone else fell down. They stood firm. It can be so easy to fall in line with the things of the world. Everyone else watches that sitcom. Why shouldn't I watch it too? All my friends listen to that kind of music. Why shouldn't I listen to it as well? save them from the fire. They didn't know that he would. They couldn't presume upon God that he could, which is a remarkable thing. To believe that. That's an impossibility, right? If you follow the science, right? If you follow the science tells you get thrown into a fiery furnace, it's curtains, right? If you follow the science, you know that's impossible. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we believe in a God of miracles. We believe in the impossibility. God can save us from the fire. But even more remarkably, also in verse 17, they knew that God would save them from the king. Now, whether that came by a miracle in the fire or death from the fire, they knew that God would deliver them from Nebuchadnezzar. Either in the furnace or the moment of death, they would meet God, the God that they served and trusted, and be delivered from the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Again, they believed that God could miraculously deliver them from the fire, but they couldn't presume that God would do that. And so in verse 18, they take their stand and say to the king, whatever our God chooses to do with us in this matter, we will not worship that image. Awkward. That's not easy. You're standing before the most powerful man in the world right now. All he has to do is say the words, stoke up the furnace and throw him in. And you're done for, if you follow the science. They stood firm in their faith. Praise God. Amen? They stood firm in their faith. They would not compromise. They would not conform and do what everybody else was doing. The king didn't take too kindly to that, which brings us now to the deliverance. Look at verses 19 through 30. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast these men, 3 men into, 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way than the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The first thing we see, this is the deliverance, okay? And the first thing we see here is... we want to note is the resolve, the resolve of these three. Just consider a moment the pressure they faced. Again, they're standing before the most powerful man in the world whose word is law. I mean, all he has to do is say it, and he's got all kinds of servants and soldiers that are going to carry out his word. And then one of the first things he said is stoke up the furnace 7 times hotter than usual. Basically what he's saying, if you remember, the number 7 is kind of the represents perfection or completion. So basically what Nebuchadnezzar was saying was, stoke it up as hot as you can get it, as hot as it'll go. And so they're watching this, as hot as you can go. He doesn't pick just any old soldiers. He picks the mighty men of the army, bind them up. So they're being bound up. Now think about what are they thinking at the moment their wrists are being tied together and their ankles are being tied together? What are they thinking? Is these guys pick them up and kind of probably, throw them over their shoulder or something. These are the mighty soldiers. They're throwing them over their shoulder, and they're walking toward the fiery furnace. What are they thinking? Are they nervous? Are they scared? Probably. Was there any temptation for them to say, okay, wait, no, we'll go ahead. We'll bow down. Apparently not. These men were resolved. They took their stand, and stand they would. They get close enough to the fire, and the fire is so hot, they stoked it up so much that these mighty soldiers succumb to the heat of the flame. And as they fall down, the way I imagine it, we don't really know exactly what happened, but I imagine they fell down, and as they fell down, they kind of pushed or shoved these 3 men into the fiery furnace. So you got these 3 guys falling into the furnace. And I just want you just to imagine for a moment, you got all these red-hot coals in the furnace. And the furnace, what the furnace probably was probably a brick kiln. Remember the walls around Babylon, and probably the statue itself was made of earth and brick. They would have needed for all those bricks, they would have needed some big kilns. And that's probably what the furnace was. And so these guys are falling in. I don't know if it was charcoal or wood or what it was, but they're seeing these red-hot coals. I mean, can you imagine if you were falling into that? You'd kind of be bracing for the impact. It's going to be bad. And I don't know exactly what it was like. I hope someday to ask these 3 guys, what was this like? But I sort of imagine them as they're getting ready. They're ready to just be seared by the heat and the intensity of the furnace, and they fall in. And I just kind of imagine it would be like, any of you from up north, you remember when you used to rake leaves and you'd fall into the leaf pile? That's kind of what I imagine it like, just nothing at all. And they sat there and they watched the ropes around their wrists burning. The ropes burn off. The ropes around their ankles burn off. But there's no heat. They're just there. And then all of a sudden, as they're watching the ropes burn, this is how I imagine. I don't know how it happened. This is how I imagine. As the ropes burn, all of a sudden they see another set of feet walking toward them. And they look up. And there he is. And that brings us to Nebuchadnezzar. We see we see the Redeemer in the fire. That's the next little point there. And that brings us to what Nebuchadnezzar says. There's 2 amazing things that the king saw as he looked on at verses 24 and 25. One, with his mighty soldiers dead lying outside the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar sees the men inside the furnace walking around. That wasn't supposed to happen because they were supposed to be bound, right? Their feet would have been tied together. They couldn't walk. They're walking. So something burned up, but it doesn't seem to be affecting them. The other thing he says is, wait a minute, didn't we throw 3 men into the furnace? Yeah, king, that's 3 men. But I see 4 walking around. And the 4th one had the appearance, as he described it, as a son of the gods. Actually, what Nebuchadnezzar saw was a pre-incarnate appearance of the eternal Son of God, who was there with them in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar's demeanor changed. He's not angry anymore. Now he's impressed. Verse 26, he calls the three friends to come out of the fire. Verse 27, this is really interesting. Those who were supposed to be impressed that day, they had been called to Babylon that day so that they could be impressed and intimidated by the golden image. What are they impressed and intimidated by now? They're gathered together, not looking at the golden image anymore. There's something far more impressive. They're looking at these three young men, and they're taking note of the fact that they're unbound. Something burned, the ropes burned, but everything else is untouched. Had no power over their body, it says. Their hair wasn't singed. Their clothes were untouched by the fire. They didn't even smell like smoke. Totally unimpacted by the fire. Nebuchadnezzar brought them there that day to be impressed by himself and by his golden image. And at the end of the day, they're all marveling at the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Our God will not be mocked. Our God will be praised. Amen? Whether today you bow the knee and confess Jesus as Lord, or you wait until it's too late, our God will be praised. Finally, we come to the royal worship and warning. Verse 28, the king blesses the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. On a day when everyone is supposed to worship the image, Nebuchadnezzar himself worships the God of heaven. He did not humble himself before God, as we will see, Lord willing, in the weeks to come. He did not repent of his pride, his arrogance, but he does seem to give glory and recognition to this God and to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That he also warns everyone not to speak against God with the promise of severe consequences, and it was probably a self-serving order. He now sees that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is an all-powerful God, and he does not want to get on that God's bad side. So he tells everyone, don't you dare speak against this God. If you do, there's going to be severe consequences for you. I don't want this God to stand against me. So it's really a self-serving. Again, we just see the selfishness and arrogance of Nebuchadnezzar in all of this. Verse 30 promotes these three men and once more. And so the story has a happy ending, right? And you love stories with happy endings? This one has a happy ending. But what if it didn't end this way? What if it didn't have a happy ending? What if the three friends had died a horrible, searing, painful death in that fiery furnace? Would it still be a good story? You see, there are many times in our lives and in your life when you're going to face severe consequences for your devotion to God. Hopefully it's not going to be a fiery furnace, but maybe it'll be the loss of friends who suddenly look down on you because you refuse to conform as you choose to stand firm in your faith. And you know what? If they do that, if they ostracize you, they're not the friends you wanted anyway. But it could be the loss of friendships. It could be the loss of a job because your witness for Christ is no longer tolerated in the workplace. I know of at least one person in this church here right now, I won't say who it is, but I know one person in this church who this last week shared the gospel with a coworker. It was during the lunch break, but it was at the workplace. What if the office manager came in and said, we can't tolerate that, pack your bags, you're done? We're going to face trials in our lives. Our faith will be tested. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7 tells us that we are going to be tested. Our faith will be put to the test. And it's not going to be easy. It could be an illness. It could be some other crisis. When those times of testing come, may we never forget that God is always by our side, even in and especially in the fiery trials. Friends, when life gets hard, just remember, you are not alone. You are not alone. God is right there with you in the fire.